How's this for irony? I have a little hatred for this book, but it's only because Joe Abercrombie, when I first discovered him with The Blade itself, upon publication, yes, I've read it that long ago, breathed new life into fantasy. You see, I grew up with Tolkien, Terry Brooks, Tad Williams, Stephen R. Donaldson. High fantasy we've all come to know and love. And I even tried George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones. You've heard of that one, right? Way back in the 90s when it was first published. I don't think I was ready for it. It was a little too dense. It was a little too slow. I did read it later in life and come to appreciate it. And yes, George R. R. Martin is a master storyteller of characterization, plot, all of the fun stuff, world building, yes, of course. But Joe Abercrombie brings a frenetic, cinematic, tactile way of writing, way of presenting fantasy that I have not seen any other writer do. So I was swept away on this crazy adventure starting with Mr. Logan Nine Fingers, and it didn't stop until I got to the very last book before the young adult trilogy, which I actually did try. I started to read the first book, just couldn't get into it. Young adult is not for me. But since that time, things have changed. I've started studying writing craft. I've started writing in my own books. I've started exploring all of the other genres out there, literary fiction, thriller, mystery, horror, all of these more deeply, getting more exposure to what good writing is. And I thought it was about time to come back to Mr. Abercrombie, the person who changed the face of fantasy for me. But did he recapture my attention, or was it all an illusion born of ignorance? Well, we are about to find out. But before I go on, if you like what I do here, if you love storytelling as much as me, give me a like. Don't worry, you can always change it later if you hate this video. Consider subscribing if you're not already. I guess we should begin with the hook. What is A Little Hatred about? Change has come to the circle of the world. Industrialization booms, lining the pockets of the rich while inciting riots among the working class. War looms. The Northmen press against the border of England. These burdens fall to the young leaders, full of ambition but blinded by arrogance. Which will prevail? So what did I think? Well, before we begin with character, I should talk about trilogies. This being the first book in a trilogy, and my philosophy on how they should be. There should be no such thing as a setup novel. This is kind of a setup novel, and I'll get into far more detail about it as we talk about the characters and the plot and the writing and everything else. My philosophy is that every single book, even in a trilogy, needs to have a completed arc. It should stand on its own. Yes, it can tease what is coming next, but what began must have some kind of an end, even if it's an open end. So with that top of mind, let us talk about A Little Hatred. Before I delve into all of the major POV characters, I think it's important to talk about theme. Yes, theme this early because Joe Abercrombie did something great, something that I believe is a prerequisite to any great novel, and that is making sure your theme is consistent with both character and plot. And he did that here, and that theme is change, one of the themes in this book. As I mentioned, we have industrialization coming to the circle of the world. Change. We also have a changing of the guard, literally, where we have most of this cast are very youthful. They are in positions of power. They are hungry for that power. But as all youth tend to be, or most youth tend to be, they're ignorant, arrogant, think they know everything. But the sad thing is, they're all this way. And it got me thinking, was this purposeful? Was Joe Abercrombie trying to say something? Was he trying to create an HBO, or actually they're called Max now, Succession situation on our hands where all of these people have been handed everything they've had, given to them without any kind of work. So they're just essentially a bunch of assholes, undeserving assholes. I would like to say that's the case. I cannot definitively say that it's not, but I feel like if it were, we'd see a little bit more consistency in that regard in the way Joe Abercrombie would present these characters to us. Yes, we have a couple of them that are absolute shits, right? We can't stand them. I couldn't stand them anyway. But we have a few that, even though they're cocky, I wouldn't say you really come to hate them. They're not necessarily unlikable characters. I guess maybe unlikable is an accurate term, but you don't really hate them. So it's kind of this mixed bag, but not a mixed bag of nuance. There are no small things that they do, observations they make, little habits they might have that set them apart, that actually show a chink in their armor. They show something a little bit deeper than what you would expect. Or maybe Joe Abercrombie is playing with the idea of, are these kids to blame for just being a product of their environment? Let us begin with a character that we begin the novel with, and that is Ricka. Rhymes with Pricka, as she says herself in the book. I believe Joe Abercrombie actually tweeted that line as well. I'm glad it was finally spelled out for me so I knew how to pronounce it, although it is kind of weird to say that to somebody in dialogue because they can hear how you're pronouncing it. Anyway. So she is a North woman. She is the son of the Dog Man. I don't want to get too far into old characters from old stories because I honestly don't remember much about them, which is another thing. I think this book needs to stand alone. It should not require you to have an intimate knowledge with what came before all of this. And I think it does pretty well for the most part. Rika has what is called the long eye, what some may call a blessing, what some may call a curse, and allows her to see into the future. And I'm sure you can tell how that ability would become very useful in a fantasy novel where you have warring factions. But as far as arc, as far as development, as far as the nuances I was talking about, what I was looking for in character, she had one glimmer of hope where, because she is from a very violent culture, a culture that is completely based on physical prowess, she questions violence. She second guesses it. She ruminates it on a little bit. And I really like that. It was toward the beginning of the novel, maybe the first quarter, but it doesn't really go anywhere. She almost changes her personality once she's reunited with her father, and then starts hanging out with a man who she has a thing for, which I think it's time to talk about him. Leo Dan Brock. He is called the Young Lion. Yes, his name is Leo. Yes, he's called the Young Lion. You heard me correctly. And this is really ironic because I've always liked Joe Abercrombie's naming conventions. I thought they were always incredibly creative. All of the cultures had their own unique flair. But this, I have no idea what the hell this was. I'm not sure if it's going to end up to be a joke because Joe Abercrombie feels like a much cleverer man than this. He's got daddy issues. His dad's dead, so I guess he has that issue. He's got mommy issues. He wants power. He wants everything. He wants to help the Union. He wants to be a hero. And he tries. He really tries. He even tries to do what some may argue is the good thing, but it's really the ignorant thing. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in the story when I talk about plot, but there's literally no depth to this man, at least in the first book. Nothing that I saw. So again, disappointing, expected. Now we should talk about his counter, Stour Nightfall. Now that's a cool name, right? He is a Northman. He is the one who wants the throne of the North. So he battles Leo. They get on the battlefield, the Union versus the North. And he's probably the biggest asshole of the bunch. He just talks shit all the time. He wants to fight everybody. He thinks he can do anything better than anybody. I mean, to his credit, he's actually a really good fighter. But again, is there anything interesting here? Is there any nuance here? Are there any things we witness him do in private that reveals anything else than what he appears to be on the surface? No, we do not, unfortunately. This theme persists. This theme of mediocrity persists. Let us talk about Broad next. His true name being Gunnar. I thought this guy would have been pretty cool if I hadn't already seen him in Blade Runner 2049. Yes, he has a crew cut. Check. He has spectacles. Check. He's a big, brooding, brawny dude coming back from the war, sorry for all of the violence he's done, and he just wants a simple life. He wants to start a simple life with his family, his daughter, and his wife. And yes, Blade Runner 2049 came out years before this book was published. I can't say Abercrombie copied that film, but man, it is uncanny. And just as a note, inspiration is fine. We are all inspired by what we see, but just try to deviate a little bit from that archetype. Anything surprising, you may ask? Anything interesting, you may ask? Not really, unfortunately. Next up is Savine, the daughter of Glokta, the torturer, the evil, evil torturer, the Inquisitor himself. She shaves her head, she wears fancy wigs, fancy clothes, she loves money, she loves to be manipulative ahead of everybody else, and she's an absolute bitch. Just like all of the guys in this book are absolute bastards, most of them anyway. Broad's not a bastard, Broad's kind of a nice guy. And this I thought was intentional. When you meet her for the first time, you absolutely hate her. So hats off to Abercrombie for making me hate this woman. And there's a little bit of catharsis to be had. She is taken down a few notches. She is traumatized, but I didn't feel like that trauma was enough. And maybe that's the point. Maybe that's the point. It's tough to say because this is the first volume in a trilogy, but I wanted more. I wanted so much more for her, and perhaps she'll get it. I know all of you out there who've read the trilogy are probably laughing at me right now, holding back comments, but please don't spoil it for anybody. She has a bit of a revelation later in the book that, again, I thought might be interesting if I hadn't already seen it in a film and another book, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about the very last and quite possibly the most boring character in this book. That is Orso. He is the crown prince, son of the king. He likes horrors, he likes drugs, he likes to get drunk. That's really all there is to know about this guy. So again, product of his environment, sure. Is that the point? Maybe. I really hope it is. But again, for a single novel, like I said, I want novels to exist in isolation. I want to be able to have enjoyed this story without reading the entire trilogy. I want the rest of the trilogy to enhance this book, not complete this book. So there is no nuance here. There are no little things, like I keep repeating over and over and over again. So you're not going to see anything very interesting from Orso. Which brings us to plot. As I mentioned, industrialization looms. Riots are happening. So this is kind of a two-pronged plot. On one hand, we have Stour, Nightfall, and Leo battling the north border. And we also have Savine and Orso dealing with the uprising. The breakers and the burners do exactly what they are called. They burn things and they break things because they're pissed off, right? All these machines, all these factories are stealing their jobs. And so they rise up and we have a rebellion on our hands. Yes, there is a battle which ends in a culturally appropriate way. I don't want to spoil it for you, but the result of that battle was kind of disappointing. I can kind of see what Joe Abercrombie is trying to do, where he's trying to take it, but I was hoping this would be the time he would subvert my expectations. I really was hoping for it. It did not happen. Speaking of Savine's little twist, a little reveal, as I mentioned, it would have been shocking perhaps if it already didn't happen in Star Wars, if it didn't already happen in Game of Thrones. Hopefully I'm not spoiling it for you, but I remember just rolling my eyes when I read this, and this almost feels like a satirical novel. And I'm wondering how much Joe Abercrombie is messing with me, or how much I'm getting in my own head and having these wild expectations that are not going to be fulfilled. I will find out when I read the rest of the series. It felt like it was supposed to be shocking. I don't know if for the reader or just for the characters. I would argue that that should be one and the same, but I was not shocked. Again, I was rolling my eyes. I honestly rolled my eyes a lot in this book, but was that the point? Was that the point? I can only say once I get to the end of this entire trilogy to see how everything plays out. But whereas Abercrombie's strengths usually lie in character, at least to me anyway, I don't want to say he's the best at designing characters, but he makes some damn good ones. The shortcomings in this novel in that regard only illuminate the shortcomings in the plot. I don't think he's ever been a great plot designer, but it doesn't really matter because when I'm really interested in the characters, when I'm having a good time, when I'm having these emotional ups and downs, the plot is less essential to me as a reader. And I'm not gonna lie, there were plenty of chapters I was just kind of, I don't wanna say I'm skimming, but I was kind of drifting. And I find that happens a lot to me in fantasy novels with a lot of POVs because the odds are you're not gonna like every POV character. And so that is an unfortunate downside to novels like this when you're like, I just want to get to the cool guy or the cool girl. I want to get to what they're doing next. That is the plot. It's all right. It's fine. This entire book is fine. I think that's the best word to describe it. If I had to give a blurb for Joe Abercrombie on the cover of this novel, it would be, it's fine. But let us talk about the writing itself, or as I like to call it, the cinematography of the novel. This is where Joe Abercrombie shines. He's an incredibly cinematic writer. It flows, it has energy. You can visualize everything. There's some clever turns of phrase, which is so welcome in a genre that feels too samey too often. Let's talk about some more awesome stuff about the writing. Joe Abercrombie does these amazing transitions, which the first time I saw them was way back in the novel The Heroes, and I felt like the effectiveness of it there was far stronger than it was here. Let me see if I can describe it to you. I like to call it the passing of the baton. It's where you have maybe there's two characters having a conversation. And then when that conversation ends, we get in the POV of the other person who was part of that conversation and they go off and do something else. Or maybe it's a proximity thing. Maybe you have somebody walking down an alleyway and then they spot somebody off to the side, or maybe they don't spot them. And then we transition to that person. And it's kind of snaking us through in a visual way, almost like a single take in a camera shot, like in 1917 or something like that. So it's incredibly visual. There's so much opportunity for subtext. Unfortunately, I didn't catch any of that here. Like I said, in The Heroes, it was done far, far better with far, far greater effect. And it's done, I think, maybe 2 or 3 times in this novel. So it didn't feel overused. It didn't feel played out. It just didn't bring the same magic that I experienced when he did it the first time. POV. Normally, Joe Abercrombie excels in this regard. And I don't want you to think he did POV terrible in this. But with POV, when you're switching from character to character, when you're in the heads of these characters in limited third person, as Abercrombie writes, the way they see things need to change. The way they phrase things need to change. Not just the word choice, but all the little things. Maybe their thoughts wander a certain way. Maybe they see things that remind them of other things. Maybe they're always looking up the ground. Maybe they're always looking up the sky. All of these things reveal character. I didn't really catch anything unique in that regard in this book outside of a Northman sounding like a Northman, or a Northwoman sounding like a Northwoman, or a Union noble sounding like a Union noble. That's really all I got out of this. I can give him credit for having distinct voices for the different archetypes or the different cultural archetypes. There are subtle differences there, but it didn't feel enough. It didn't, again, reveal character. I should talk about a couple of pet peeves of mine that he is very guilty of. The first one being starting a chapter with dialogue. Okay, there's nothing wrong with it as long as you're purposeful. I always talk about things like this with writing. Nothing in writing is bad if it's purposeful, right? If there's a reason for it. That doesn't mean the reader has to like it, but as long as you're intentional with what you're doing, it's fine. This book opens with dialogue. In fact, the name Rika, that is the first line in this book. And it's okay there because it's purposeful. However, other parts in this book suffer from that. They didn't feel purposeful. And you may be asking, why would you even start a chapter with dialogue? I believe it's a tactic used to try to create immediacy. So when we're watching a film or a TV show, we can cut into a scene. We can be thrown into there and it feels like we're in media res. However, books, we cannot see books. It takes a few words to paint a picture for us. While in a movie, we can see the room, we can see the lighting, we can see the staging of the shot. We can see the person speaking. It's less jarring. When you're reading a book, it takes some time before you can gather yourself, before you can orient yourself. But again, if done for effect, like it was when the opening of the book, I thought it was because Rika was disoriented. She was having this weird vision. And so, of course, that made sense in that regard. Other times in the book, not so much. Another thing before I end the writing section is not identifying a POV character soon enough. It is done with effect, to great effect in this book, one time. However, there are others where I was like, whose head am I in? This is so frustrating. He's going on describing things paragraph after paragraph before I even see a name, but it doesn't hit you. It doesn't feel purposeful, in which case I think it is a mistake. And it's too bad because I think overall Joe Abercrombie is a fantastic prose writer. There's just a lot of things that could have been tightened up. I just wanted to see how much he's grown as a writer because he's been writing in this world for so long, and maybe that's part of the problem is that he spent far too much time in this world. I hear that his next book is going to be something not part of this world, and I'm so excited for it. I want to see what else he has to offer because I think that's the best decision to make when you've been writing so many books for so long in the same world with the same cultural representation. Which is why I'm going to give Joe Abercrombie's A Little Hatred a 6.5 out of 10. An extremely readable, underwhelming story full of characters we've all seen before, archetypes we're too familiar with, plot lines we've all seen before that we are, again, too familiar with, without a satisfying arc to close out this novel, which brings me full circle to why I wanted to talk about in the beginning, why it's extremely important to me as a reader to have a completed book, to make it feel done, make it have some kind of resonance, give me some catharsis, because if I picked this book up when it came out, I would have to wait an entire year to see where the story went. How frustrating would that be? But do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? I would love to hear it in the comments. I know fantasy fans are a very rabid, very loyal fan base, so come at me. I want to hear all of it. Tell me how awesome it gets in book 2 and book 3. Tell me how I'm totally wrong. Tell me how I missed so much, how I misread the entire text. I would love to hear all of it. And if you would like to check out my own work, my own novels, check out the link in the description. And thanks for watching. Thanks for hanging out with me, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.